Hi, everybody. Welcome to Masters of Madness, the podcast version, or also known as the Jen and Joe Show, also known as History Al Dente. We have so many names. What's in a name? So we're playing around with some names for what to call this. But I'm Jen Dozier,
I'm Joe Stitch.
and we are here with you today to talk about our very first episode, our first go at this. This is our little project we've been working on for about a year now?
About that.
Yeah, coming up on a year. And it was just kind of spawned from our love of trying to understand better these historical figures that we've come to know, we've heard about our whole lives in a variety of contexts, and analyzing them a little bit through a psychological lens, interested in what we can learn about leadership qualities from them. And our first person to investigate was Mr. General Douglas MacArthur. So, a little bit about our approach. Why are we doing this? Why did we start with MacArthur? And then also, what does food have to do with this, Joe?
Food has something to do with everything,
Yes.
as we have found out, because most of our meetings happen over lunch.
Yes. You can't, dive into this and do all these complicated brain thingies without having some sustenance. So,
Wow.
yes, we like to go and enjoy some lunch, some local fare, and have a full belly while we talk about these. And then it got us thinking about, the cultural aspects of these leaders and historical figures that we're investigating and what their food preferences were, how food played a role in their lives in those historical moments in time.
And food is part of what you are. In our kitchen, we have a little cutting board, and it has a saying on it that says, "Tell me how you eat, and I'll show you who you are." And
Nice.
so, we'll talk a little bit at the end about some of MacArthur's culinary habits and some of the true roles that food and drink played in his social life.
Yes, I love this. I love learning about people through these little idiosyncrasies, these preferences, these habits that we have. And food is just so integrated in our lives, in our culture, in our relationships.
Really is.
And it is. It's so reflective of who we are and where we come from. So that's sort of how food ties into this. We're enjoying food and we're discussing these figures. And then it teaches us a little bit about who they are and where they've come from. So that's our general approach. And the first figure that we went with to investigate for this project was General Douglas MacArthur. And we have some personal reasons and professional reasons why we started out with him, right, Joe?
Correct. You first.
So for me, MacArthur is this kind of larger than life figure that I've grown up, whose name I've grown up hearing my whole life. I'm from Norfolk. I'm a native of Norfolk, born and raised here. I'm an OV girl. Go OV. And so, street names and buildings are MacArthur Center, that's in downtown Norfolk, the memorial being right here in my hometown. And then the basic general information that I've come to know about him through history courses and the knowledge that's imparted on us as natives here. And so for me, this was a nice place to start because we didn't have to go too far to even learn a little bit more about his personal background, his military achievements and service, because we have the memorial right here in town. So we were able to visit the memorial and learn a little bit about him, see some of his artifacts, some of the actual things from his life that he used, and personal family things that the family was able to share with the memorial. So for me, that was why MacArthur was a great place to start.
Yeah, in my case, my dad joined the Marines in 1938. So by the time the United States was in World War II, he was a non-commissioned officer, went overseas with the First Marine Division, and as many Marines did, had a very negative image of Douglas MacArthur. Um, he felt that Douglas MacArthur did not give the Marines their due, but he used them as shock troops and then allowed Army troops to come in and get all the credit for what had happened. There were swear words that were more acceptable in my house than a good, kind word about Douglas MacArthur. So I grew up with this very negative view of Douglas MacArthur. And I thought, well, here's a great opportunity to find out, whether some of the stuff I've heard was right or not.
Nice. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I feel like with a lot of these controversial figures that we're interested in taking a look at for this series, this project that we're doing, is you hear a little bit of both. You don't know what's true. There's so many urban legends, so many things have been, expanded over the years, and so separating the fact from fiction is a task in and of itself. So I think he's definitely one of those figures where you have a quote actually. You either loved him or hated him. One of his.
Yeah, one of his classmates at West Point said, with Douglas MacArthur, you either loved him or hated him. You can't just like him. So you think of all the people that you know where someone would ask you, hey, do you know so and so? And you would say, well, yes, I know her. What's she like? Well, she's okay, or he's okay. Uh, yes, that's a lot of people, not Douglas MacArthur. You were either hopelessly devoted to him or you could not stand him.
Wow.
So there's no middle ground there, and we'll see that's the case.
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure, that is for sure. Let's start with talking a little bit about his family background. We know he was from Norfolk.
Right. His mom came from Norfolk. She was part of an old Southern family here, but his lineage goes way, way back. So imagine, and we all come from somewhere. And imagine if you were told your whole life that your family lineage went back to King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, or the court of Charlemagne in the Frankish Empire in early medieval days. If your ideas are your life is filled with this. As it turns out, he's also a distant relative of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and
Wow.
Winston Churchill. So then his father, you have this father who's this larger than life figure. His father was a young officer in the Union Army in the Civil War. And at the Battle of Missionary Ridge, his troops and under his care had been pinned down by Confederate fire. And General or Lieutenant MacArthur grabs the American flag and starts leading a charge up the ridge and winds up carrying the ridge, and he's awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Missionary Ridge. Later becomes a general in the Army. MacArthur's grandfather was a judge, a Supreme Court or a Washington D.C. Supreme Court judge, and entertained all kinds of the cream of society in their house. So here's a guy who, as far as his family background goes, is sort of poised for greatness from his earliest memory. His mom came from Norfolk, Virginia. Uh, her brothers had fought with the Confederacy, so she represents an old Southern family, and she is going to, as we'll see, remain a dominant figure pretty much throughout his life. And MacArthur himself grows up on the frontier of the United States. You talk about a guy that really kind of saw it all and experienced it all. Uh, he would say later in his own particular style. My first memory was of a bugle call. Well, that's a little bit theater there, but he was living out on the frontier.
Sure.
His mom provided for his education when he was young. And it wasn't until later, when he was in what we would think of today as high school age, about 1893, he enters the West Texas Military Academy in San Antonio. So here's a guy that had never been much of a student, and he gets into this military environment and thrives. And 4 years later, he graduates. He's valedictorian. He's participated in sports. He never was a great sportsman, but he considered it an important part of education, and he gave it as the old college try. And by this time, also, he's been recognized for his skill in public speaking, and he was a very skillful orator. But like Cicero and some others, he did not always use that to his own advantage. It
Okay.
sometimes got him into some kind of trouble as well.
Because that's how I feel the videos, the photographs you see of him. He's a showman. He's larger than life,
Mhm.
really, and so he really leans into those features of being able to, and to me, when I think of a good leader, I think of someone who can emotionally champion those around him. So, do you see that's pretty safe to say that he could really champion people to his cause?
Yeah, well, he did that because he had such a filter on who he allowed to be close to him. If you were close to him, you were already, it was because you were a champion of his
Because you loved
cause,
him, right?
because you loved him, right? Um, but it would be wrong. So here we we might think of this person as well. He's born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's had his way
Right.
every time, but that's not the case. He wanted to get an appointment to West Point, but there were a couple of obstacles in his path. One of them was he had a spinal defect that uh, could easily have kept him out of West Point. And I was going to follow in my dad's footsteps and join the Marines, but when I took my eye exam, my eyes were too bad, and I just thought, well, okay, I'm going to regroup and go do something else. Not MacArthur's mother. MacArthur's mother hired an orthopedic surgeon to work with him for months and months until this spinal defect was corrected. He was concerned about his entrance exam, of it being able to pass it. She hired a school principal to tutor him, and was relentless until he was so upset. At one point, he just when he walked in to take his exam, he had to throw up because he was just had so much anxiety
Wow.
because his mom had really been pounding him with this
Hmm.
tutor. So he had to overcome these obstacles and did win an appointment, of course, to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. So um, after the military academy, he then saw some action in Mexico, the campaign down there to hunt down Pancho Villa, which was ultimately unsuccessful. But he did make good contacts. He exhibited extreme valor in dangerous situations. And then once the United States declared war on Germany in 1917, he went to the Western Front there, where by 1918 he was a brigadier general at the ripe old age of 38. So
Wow. And
uh,
this is sort of atypical then. This is not the normal
no, no,
progression.
no, no, not at all. He was decorated for valor several times by many different countries, and it looked at the time that his career was wide open, as it would be.
Wow. That's fascinating.
So there's a old adage about him, or feeling about him, that Douglas MacArthur was one of these generals that didn't like being around enemy fire, and you hear this over and over again that all of his appearances, especially after in World War II, when video footage, camera footage is available, that he had everybody make sure that enemy troops had long been removed from an area before he made an appearance, and that's not true. Uh, in World War One, as I mentioned, he exposed himself repeatedly to enemy fire. He led from the front, which is a popular way for troops. His troops in World War One saw him there, and his World War One troops tended to adore him for that. Uh, it's only in World War II, and this happens as a result of the Philippines campaign early in the war, that he gets this moniker. They called him Dugout Doug because he stayed in this tunnel on the island of Corregidor, where his wife and child were, by the way, and didn't come out to the battlefield as much as he had in World War One. Not really sure why that happened, but people started calling him Dugout Doug. That he stayed under cover, that he was afraid to come out and expose himself to enemy fire. But later in the war, he was more than willing to put himself in positions where his subordinates were very uncomfortable that he might wind up getting himself killed. And even after the Japanese surrendered, when he landed in Japan, there were certain elements there that were hostile to the Americans, and they were afraid he would be assassinated. And he simply waved these people away and drove on down to his hotel where he was going to live. And Japanese people loved that about him. They adored him. He was essentially a warlord there after World War II. And so these ideas that he was afraid of being shot or felt any fear. In fact, quite the contrary. It looks to me like he's one of these people that just never felt any fear at all
Wow.
for any reason. So,
Do you think that he heard some of that perception? Perception's more than reality, we say. So maybe if he had heard, some of this talk of the nicknames there being, being behind the scenes, not being on the front lines, that made him change his behavior, or that it was just a kind of a fluke. Maybe he just wanted to be a protective father, husband at that time.
It could be, and and there's all kinds of examples historically where in critical areas